welcome back to the 12th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 31st, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I'm excited because we have a lot of quick announcements right here at the top. First and foremost, this is episode 400 consecutive weeks of the Faith and Science podcast. That deserves some celebration. So later this week, I will drop kind of a follow-up, thought through, give you a little bit more behind the scenes. I know I've teased talking about some different music stuff with it. Also kind of talk about a little bit of things that I'm kind of doing here behind the scenes a little bit, and discussing some of the different things that I've been tweaking, adjusting, making modifications to. Would love to hear insight on different things, so make sure to check that out later this week. Additionally, last week we dropped our first interview podcast. It was super exciting. Now, first and foremost, I have to apologize if you are listening to the audio only version in the first, I'll say 36 hours. I actually had the wrong file up. It was only like a minute long. The actual podcast where I'm interviewing with Dr. Boris is over an hour long. So if you didn't get that, make sure to check that out. Also, I did have a visual component of it. You can check out the YouTube page, and if you look in the show notes, I always have our YouTube page in there, and you will find there's a face-to-face conversation through Zoom of Dr. Boris and I talking. So if there's something there, and there's some different visual components and stuff I added to that. So make sure you check that out. I had a lot of fun with it. It was a really good learning experience for me. There's a lot of things that I want to take from that as I consider trying to do a few more of these. And I would love to hear feedback, both positive and negative, things that you wish I would have done, things that you enjoyed that I did. I'm really wanting to test that out, and I want to hear what you guys thought of it. I know for me, I had a lot of fun with doing it, and I definitely want to try doing a few more of those. So keep an eye out for those, and hopefully we'll have this kind of secondary thing that we have on the side that we do on occasion. So it's an exciting time here at the podcast to be thinking about things and to be going through things, but it's also, let's look back to last week, which we had the question of where do you take and when do you take your Sabbath? And I think there's a lot of different responses that you can get for that. You can get the responses of the different hobbies and interests that we have. We have also the different seasonality of different things and trying to figure that out. I know for myself, as I kind of talked about last week, it's one of the things that we'll talk a little bit more in the 400th episode podcast that'll come out later this week. There's been some things that I've been trying to work on to figure out some balance for myself. There's a lot of time and a lot of effort that goes into making this podcast happen week after week, some of which I think some people didn't even recognize that I was doing with different aspects of it. So there's certain things I kind of pulled back on. There's certain things that I'm trying to move forward with. And so it's kind of this consistent balancing act. But I think that's also a good representation of life in general. We go through different seasons, we go through different times, and it's this constant trying to figure out where is the balance? What am I called to do at this time? What am I not called to do? And we've talked about that a lot in the last year in particular. Kind of trying to figure that balance out is something that's really important and sometimes can be very difficult as well. So let's just jump into it. We have some really kind of fun texts this week. So one of the ways that you can take it, the Old Testament text this week, is out of Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 4 to 13. This is a text here where now we have the prophet Jeremiah kind of talking to the people of Israel and reminding them on how their ancestors turned their back to God at different points, and how, one, that hurt God, but also two, how God continued to pursue them. And even though they weren't necessarily looking for God, they were at times looking at different other gods or turning their face away from God, God continued to pursue them. And so there's times that we need to remember that within ourselves, the different times where we have pulled away, but also in that, don't use that as an excuse to continue to be apart. Looking at that as something where God is continuing wanting to be closer to us and God continues to pursue us. And in doing that, if we give that time, that's when we can really understand the fruits of what God has laid out for us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 81, verse 1, and then 10 through 16. So this is the recognition then that the strength that we have comes from the Lord, and it's that the voice of the Lord is then within us, and that the voice of the Lord comes out of us. And we have to recognize it's not by the works of what we do. It's the works of what God does within us that come out. And thus, we then need to acknowledge what God is doing in that and allowing us to be able to give this voice of who we are to God. We have two alternative texts then for this other Old Testament text this week, and I'd recommend maybe using both of these. It's kind of fun. So the first one of that is then Sirach, chapter 10, verses 12 to 18. Sirach is in the Apocrypha. It's this section of books that are in between the Old Testament and New Testament, and depending on your Christian denomination, on whether or not it's technically part or not part, but it's a really good supplemental reading and at least is filling in that gap. And this one I think is a really interesting one because it starts talking about human pride and how that plays into this. I think the first verse in particular is really good. The beginning of human pride is to forsake the Lord. The heart has withdrawn from its maker. This idea then of how pride kind of continues to grow and overtakes. And in that, then it pulls us apart from God and it wrecks us from being humble. It's telling us to keep doing more and more. It's this recognition on how in this separation, it's this demand, the things that keep going deeper, the things that keep going further, that keep getting brought up. The other alternative Old Testament text that you can also have is on Proverbs chapter 25, verses 6 and 7. And I'd highly recommend using at least parts of this week or the whole thing because Jesus will reference it in the gospel text this week. And I'm just going to read these starting in verse 6 of chapter 25. Do not put yourself in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. For it is better to be told, come here, than to be put in a lower presence of a noble. The idea of that we shouldn't be self-elevating ourselves, let others elevate us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 112, all 10 verses of it. And this is recognizing and praising God, but also recognizing our history, recognizing what has been done. And in doing that, recognizing how God has been part of all of that. And that is not necessarily something just purely of that one person or purely of my family or purely of our people, but that it's God who is continuing to give us this beauty to be able to do. And thus, if we get consumed with the self, this is where then we can start losing sight of that. And in that, that's when a lot of times we are separated, and then there is more infighting. There is more hardships because of this break of this bond. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 to 8 and 15 and 16. This is, again, this idea of how God wants to be in relationship with us, but yet there are so many things that we as humans will at times put ahead of God. We start putting our love of money, we start putting our love of ourselves in front of God, and thus makes it more difficult for God to be able to communicate with us on what God is trying to do with us, what God has designed us to be able to do. And so if we are able to sacrifice and give praise to God, it allows God to be able to work through us. And it's not necessarily neglecting all these things. It's this recognition on there are times that we try to elevate ourselves further than what God has desired for us to be at that point. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 14, verse 1 and verse 7 through 14. This is a moment where Jesus gets invited to dinner with the Pharisees and notices how people are placing themselves around the table and where they are placing themselves. And Jesus then goes into this parable starting in verse 8, comparing it to a wedding feast and recognizing how it is better to be lifted up. And we get this idea here, like we got in the Proverbs starting in verse 10, to be lifted to a place of honor than being in a place that's of honor and saying, scoot down, move down. We need to put this other person here. And then he goes further and talks about how this luncheon, how he invites all these rich people and recognizing how it's easy for us to do that. but then they don't give anything in return. Instead, then Jesus says, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and they will be blessed. And yes, they cannot repay you, but this is what the kingdom of God is more like. This is the righteousness of God. This recognition on how we're all together and this beauty of when we are all together, what is able to come from it. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help me give me some ideas, direction, ideas to be thinking about with these texts. And especially with the back catalog that they have, a lot more than 400 than me, there's some really great resources over there. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also have hymns, art, prayers, liturgical colors. If you're wanting what are the daily readings that support this, it's an amazing resource for that. It really helps being able to make the week more of preparing for worship and coming into worship prepared. I think this is really something that we don't talk about enough. And I think it really allows us the possibility to really get more out of these texts. So if you take that little bit of additional time, maybe even just looking through the text week to week, and I'd highly recommend checking out Vanderbilt's Divinity Library for that, to help you prepare for that week so that when you get to the pews, you are ready. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that goes through a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies and different events going on, talking about how we can look at the environment more within our preaching week after week. So if you enjoy listening to these homilies, these weekly podcasts going through the text, I know you're going to enjoy those resources. So I'd highly recommend checking out the links for the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. That'll be the first link down in the show notes. In our world, in the place that we're at, I think it's sometimes really difficult to wrap our heads around the idea of being humble. There's so many things within the world in which we're in that we're used to the idea of that I am the focus of the movie of myself. And there are supporting characters who are major and minor. Some come, some go. But yet I am the star of my life. And in a lot of ways that is true. But there's a lot of ways where that can also get very overbearing, overwhelming, and sometimes that can get very arrogant. And in doing that, we start thinking at times that we are more worthy of things than other things. And especially as human nature, I think as humans, we struggle with this. So I don't argue, especially with a parable like we have this week, and where Jesus is quoting to the Pharisees by chance, the ones who should know the scriptures, straight Proverbs to them. I think it's a good example for us to acknowledge and to think about. Maybe we need to go beyond the human experience this week to understand more of what God is desiring for us and being able to apply that within our own lives. And my argument is I think we need to look specifically at our plant life will help us understand this concept, I think, at a much deeper level. So let's dive into it a little bit. First and foremost, we need to understand when we are moving beyond the human experience, and especially when we talk about plants, for instance, as a human looking at a plant's life, the main goal of a plant is to reproduce, to be able to have that next generation from them, having that next generation of kin. And we can get that image. Yes, there is beautiful flowers and there's beautiful fruits and all these different things, but it's all about reproduction. It's all about making sure that we are able to have that next generation. So when we're looking at a flower, if we think about it from that perspective, the idea of, well, why aren't flowers then always in bloom? Why don't they, at least from spring to fall, always be in bloom? Because if their whole idea is to be able to produce the next generation, wouldn't it be better if they had this long extended period of time where they were available and ready to be able to pollinate their plants. Now let's break that down a little bit before we answer that question. First, we need to understand that there are male and female parts to a plant. So we have the stamen, which has where the pollen is. And then we also have the pistil, which in the pistil has the ovaries, and that's where the eggs are. And so the whole idea is that then they have developed a mutualistic relationship with insects, bees, hummingbirds, that they come in and are able to get nectar, which is this sugary substance within the flower. And while doing that, the pollen rubs off on them so that they can then go to the next plant and then being able to take that genetic material and have it go to the next plant, and thus being able to get a good mixing of genetics, being able to have where you're having different populations or different plants at minimum, being able to get this pollen and being able to spread and have new genes and making sure that they're still strong and healthy plants. Again, this is the whole idea. Now, the one thing that we overlook, and getting back to the initial question that we had of why aren't they flowering year-round then, or extended periods of time, it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort for a plant to bloom. Because yes, you could continue to grow leaves, which then are these energy sources for the plant, and you need to make sure that you have enough energy to be able to excrete extra energy into something that isn't going to directly benefit you. You're going to excrete these flowers that are going to be able to help produce for the next generation, which is extremely important, but it isn't going to directly benefit you. Okay, so if we're going to try doing that all summer, that's a lot of additional and extra energy for that to happen. And that doesn't seem like a great business plan, to be constantly putting out all this extra energy and not sure what's going to come from it. That's where there's another part of this equation we need to talk about, and it's in the soil, quite literally, in the soil. And that's mycelium. Now, mycelium is a type of fungi. It's a fungus. It's a mushroom typically. But what mycelium does, and we have talked about this before, it's essentially the internet for plants. It is able to communicate back and forth. It is able to send nutrients back and forth through mycelium, connecting plants together. And we've talked about it before, like in tree stands where you have an elder tree that the end is coming. I'm going to take this big boost of energy. I'm going to take it all and I'm going to send it out and specifically target some of the smaller plants. I'm going to take all my energy because I'm dying. Or you can put a call out into the network. I'm really struggling right now. Does anybody have any additional resources of this? And they're able to send it through the mycelium to these plants. Super awesome for the plants. What do the mycelium get? They are getting some of the matter of the plants as they die and break down. It's food for the mycelium. But two, the plants will give up some of its energy, some of the carbohydrates, and allow the mycelium to be able to grow in that, thus being able to have this amazing network of plants communicating back and forth. What has that allowed plants to do? What has that allowed plants to do is being able to communicate back and forth on when different plants are going to be flowering. And so thus, instead of having it where everything's blooming all the time and making it very difficult for the plants that are flowering to actually be pollinated, because there's still a limited number of insects to be able to pollinate. Whereas if they have these different seasons or different time periods where they're blooming and not blooming, it gives them a higher likelihood of actually being pollinated. Because now the insects are flying around, it's more likely that they were pollinating another plant of a similar species when they're coming and getting the nectar from them. It's actually a win-win for everybody. But why is this being talked about with these texts? Technically, a flower could decide that it's going to bloom in spring and it's going to keep blooming and keep putting all that energy out there and keep putting all that work and effort into it all the way to fall, all the way to frost. From frost out to frost in, it's going to be flowering. But it's a lot of additional effort. It's a lot of additional work. It's a lot of different throwing things out into the wind, and it may or may not actually turn out. And it's also saying, look how important I am, that I always have to be in bloom. Whereas when we have seasonality, when we have different parts of the summer where different flowering plants are flowering, it also kind of brings a different beauty. It recognizes that certain things are special. It gives the plants the opportunity to really be able to pollinate and be able to pass on the seeds for the next generation much easier because they're not always in bloom. But it takes being humble. It takes being able to take that time and really truly recognize that. It takes being able to communicate with other plants to recognize that there's other times that others need to flower as well. And it doesn't mean that two can't be flowering at the same time. You go into a garden, there's plenty of times where you have different plants of different species flowering at the same time. But also there's a time where a lot of those plants are not blooming and they're coming. Just wait. I look at a lot of different things within business, within the world, and I think this is a concept we as humans are really struggling with, especially within the Industrial Revolution age still that we are. Downtime is wasted time. Not being able to be 100% productive. And in doing that, stating that we should be more productive, more this, more that, we're being very prideful. We're stating that we're so important, we need to always be top of mind. And I don't think that's the way that we are supposed to be designed. I know for me, one of the things that I've been rediscovering, I mentioned that I've been doing some running and some training for a race that I'll do in a couple months, and I'll talk about that later. But part of that, there's been times where my headphones haven't worked. And so there's been some real decently long runs, at least for me, that I haven't had any music. I haven't had anything playing on my phone. It's just me and my thoughts. And the continued drive that I just need to keep running, keep moving. And when you let the mind wander, when you let the mind have that space, how much more creative, how much more understanding of things, being able to put pieces together. It's like I need this breath to be able to really, truly understand what's going on. I think this is one of the things that we're really lacking in our society and our culture, especially in the United States. Everything has to be news all the time. And sometimes we don't allow ourselves that moment to take a breath. We don't allow ourselves that opportunity to be able to say, this is a season where I'm doing this, and then after that, I'm going to set it down for a little while. Right now, yes, I'm training to do some distance running, but I fully intend when I'm done, I'm going to go to much shorter races and probably do some additional training that's completely outside of the running realm because I just want something different. It's time for something new. It's time for something different. And it also allows my body, there's certain parts where I know it's getting a little beat up. It needs some time to heal. And sometimes that takes a while and sometimes it doesn't take a while. It's just a matter of what the injury is and what's going on within you. I think it's really easy for us to keep making things really important, saying this should be the most important thing going on in your world right now. This should be. But that's a very prideful statement. We don't know what's going on. And I think it's a lot of times we don't have the mycelium networks within ourselves to be able to really check what's going on with others. We just always assume whatever we're working on is most important because we're so used to this idea that we are the star of our show. And why are you disrupting my show? When I look at plants being able to figure out and understand there's different things that it's able to do that benefit the plant by being able to communicate with each other, by understanding that I'm not always in bloom, I'm not always at 100%, I think there is a lot there we could learn. I think there is an aspect of going back to last week, being able to take a Sabbath, being able to take a period of time where maybe it's not 100% like a Sabbath, maybe it's the idea of instead of going at 100%, we're going to drop down to 50% for a while. Because that other 50% needs to be used other places, or it's going to allow for more creative thoughts so that when we come back and move up to 100%, we're maybe have rethought some things and it makes it actually a better thing. When we're constantly going harder and harder and harder, I think there's an aspect too that we miss and we forget the things that we've kind of pushed aside in order to do that. Look at the tribe of Israel and how that's brought up in Jeremiah this week and how they ended up completely losing their way. Because they forgot to be able to take this time to be able to recognize what God has done for them. The pride within ourselves, if I did this, destroys us. Little bit by little bit, it destroys us. And it's not the idea that we can't take recognition for things. But if we get to the point where we're fully recognizing that it's all us, if we're getting to the point where it's always got to be, we're the number one thing going on, we've missed it. We've missed the boat. We're not allowing others to shine. We're not allowing ourselves actually time to rethink and to recover and to regroup. We see it in nature. We see it in God's creation. Why are we so resistant to it? So the question I have for you this week is, where is pride taking over your Sabbath? Where is pride taking over your Sabbath? Because I would argue in our pride, we become like the Pharisees and elevate ourselves. That in these moments where we should be humbling ourselves, taking a Sabbath, relaxing and say, I don't need to be the focus of what is going on. Instead, we try to elevate ourselves and say, yes, this isn't my event, but you know what? I still should be recognized. I still should have some focus on me, because look at how great I am. It is better to be elevated by others than placing yourself there. And I think that is an amazing thing that we do need to work on. I know for myself, that's something I need to keep working on. That sometimes means also setting boundaries for ourselves as well. If creation around us is doing this, I think this is an ideal of what God is designing the creation to look like. And we're the ones who are rebelling. We're the ones that aren't falling in line. We're the ones that need to take a solid look at this. I think this is a lot of places. I think in sports media, I think is a specific one. I could go all off on that. But I think even just how schools are working within the United States. I think how churches are working in the United States. I think how businesses are working in the United States. I think there's a lot of aspects of this that we really should take a good amount of time and reflect on. Because I don't think we need to always be the number one thing going on. Because I think when we do that, we end up hurting ourselves. We lose sight of what we were initially going for anyways. Allow ourselves to be humble. Allow ourselves to be elevated. Allow ourselves to actually understand the benefits of what that actually means. Lift others up instead of always placing yourself there. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.